We're in the information age, but facts are in short supply. Reject the noise, ask bold questions, and seek the truth with FBI whistleblower and common sense extremist Steve Friend. This is the American Radicals Podcast.
It is the American Radicals Podcast. It's April 14th, 2026, and today we're going to get into some revelations about the first Donald Trump impeachment. Also, the Department of Justice and Big Tech continue to collude with each other. Illegal alien deportations are on the decline, and some private property owners are now suing because their property was destroyed by the police. So, let's get after it. One of the fundamental questions that I repeatedly ask on this show is how we should view the law. Why do we have laws? That's actually a very specific question that's brought up in Harvey Silverglate's book, 3 Felonies a Day. Pretty simple, but have you really ever thought about it? Why do we have laws? Well, to ensure a safe and just society, to protect the innocent, to punish the evildoers? Or are they arrows in the quiver of a government, a weaponized government that no longer looks at the people who they're duty bound, their customers, to protect against fraud and force, but rather as an opportunity? It goes back to the shield versus the sword. The law should always be a shield, protection against fraud and force, never a sword, never to be used aggressively, offensively, to go after those who you deem to be engaging in right thing, wrong thing, however you want to characterize it. It is not your job, if you're in a position in the government, if you raise your hand and swear an oath to protect and defend our pesky, dusty documents, to be the arbiter of what is right and what is wrong. The law does that for you. If somebody gets their toes right up to the edge, right there, you know what that is? Legal. You can't then novelly interpret the way that that line has been drawn to make sure that it's just behind their feet. Now they're running afoul. And increasingly, that's what we're seeing. And it also goes back to a biblical question. It is incumbent on the government, the institutions which we have implemented via a social compact where we agree to give up a little bit of our liberties in return for certain very finite amount of charges, one being protection against fraud and force. They must punish evil. If they don't, then in reality, they are punishing good. So I want to get to a whole host of examples today. The question is the law a sword or a shield in this instance? And is the government actually fulfilling its mandate to punish evil? Or by its lack of action, is it actually punishing good? Now, we did have some revelations because this is the story that is going out there now because it's very politically convenient for the Republicans who are getting smashed in the polls as we're heading into a midterm. They got to bring up the old stuff, right? They got to get everybody amped up about old stories, which are egregious and they're horrible examples of weaponization. But really, what's the fallout? Where's the accountability? And that's actually how we're going to close things up today. But there were some new revelations. Bombshell. This comes from the Federalist. It's been reported elsewhere, but headline: breaking transcript from 2019 exposes more deep state machinations against Trump. This is all about the first impeachment, the very perfect phone call when Donald Trump was talking to Zelensky before everybody knew who Zelensky even was, before he was the leader of democracy for the entire world, which emerged, 3 years later when Donald Trump was no longer the president. Now, before we get to some of the details here, just want to clear up our terms, clear up our individuals who we need to know. The main guy you need to know is the former Inspector General of the intelligence community. His name is Michael Atkinson. And then you also need to know what the HPSCI is. That's the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. Let's go for it. All right. So we're dealing with a very perfect phone call. The Inspector General, Atkinson, for the intelligence community, he's the watchdog. He's at the top of that food chain. he has to take up any sort of whistleblowing that goes on within the intelligence community. Well, a whistleblower comes forward and says, hey, it wasn't such a perfect phone call. So IG Atkinson starts to investigate, or at least he tries to. But the Department of Justice says, no, the phone call between the President of the United States and the President of Ukraine does not involve the intelligence community, so you actually don't have any jurisdiction here. And they wind up clearing it. Well, that wasn't enough for Mr. Atkinson, so he took it upon himself to bring forward a referral over to the House of Representatives. And this was again in 2019. This is after the midterms. This is after the Democrats were now in charge. You had Adam Schiff, who I think was at the helm of the House House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. The names just kind of get to me. So I think we're getting a little bit politically partisan here. He brings this over to the House. And then Nancy Pelosi initiates an impeachment inquiry. And eventually we actually have the impeachment trial. She launches it. And then we're introduced to another name that I think if you are a viewer or a consumer of the news will be somebody who you know, and that's Alexander Vindman. He's the really doughy military guy who came forward. He was the star witness in the impeachment because he had been in the Situation Room listening in real time when Donald Trump was having a conversation with the Ukrainian president and made all these allegations. He was trying to weaponize the processes. He was trying to blackmail a leader of another state in order to go and dig up dirt on his political opponent because it was presumed at that point that Joe Biden was the leading candidate to go against Donald Trump the following year in the presidential election. So back to this piece, we're kind of doing the timeline and we're showing whether or not the processes, the law, were they a shield, were they a sword? So Nancy Pelosi launches the impeachment. We find out who Alexander Vindman is. But Vindman was not the actual whistleblower. He was a star witness, but not the official whistleblower. That was this other guy. He was Voldemort, Eric Charamella. We can't name his name. We have to protect the identity of the whistleblower, Eric Charamella. Say his name like Beetlejuice 3 times. If you say it in the dark, he'll appear behind you. Eric Charamella, Eric Charamella, Eric Charamella. What was his actual whistleblowing, though? I mean, do you have a legitimate, reasonable concern of waste, fraud, abuse, risk to the public safety, violation of rule, policy, procedure, or law? Did he actually? Well, now these new transcripts, as they've come to pass here and being reported on in the Federalist, no, he didn't. Charamella, the whistleblower, brought forward a memorandum to the Inspector General. And he said, I have a reasonable concern that our president has done something that is in violation of his oath of office. What was it? He said, I talked to somebody who listened to the phone call and they told me that it was improper. Now, we all know that the person who Charamella was talking to was Vindman, right? I mean, that's pretty clear that the timeline matches up. He's made no secret about that. But I don't think that qualifies as whistleblowing. Does that make you a hero to the Republic because you're a third party? You had a conversation with somebody and didn't have any firsthand knowledge? But let's go further, because at that point, how do you proceed with an investigation if you don't have a reasonable allegation? There is no accuser at that point. But that didn't dissuade the Inspector General for the intelligence community, who had already been told, you do not have jurisdiction here. But he was an intrepid investigator, a watchdog, and he had to go after Donald Trump because he was mean, orange, and literally Hitler. We had some other elements here. So Charamella comes out. He says, I talked to this guy. Did the Inspector General talk to that guy? That guy being Vindman? No, he didn't. He wound up interviewing some supervisors for Charamella and somebody else who's they don't really go into. And the Inspector General did not even read the transcript for the call. Do you remember when all this was going on? Donald Trump said, it was a very perfect phone call. It was fantastic. It was the greatest thing ever. In fact, I'm going to release the full transcript of our conversation. So for the American people, they can look at it. And the Inspector General didn't look at it and still said, you know what, this is a reasonable concern. We still need to go forward. After that, after already being shot down. Hey, you're the inspector general, the intelligence community. You don't have jurisdiction here. You've now made this referral over to the House of Representatives. It's getting very political. Why don't you just go back to oversight of the IC? Well, he wasn't done then, because what Michael Atkinson then felt obligated to do was refer Donald Trump to the FBI for investigation. He brought forward all his case files and he said, hey, I'm going to give this to the Counterintelligence Division so you can investigate the sitting president of the United States. Well, that got shut down. But then the FBI, because it always goes back to the FBI. The FBI, after having been shut down, approached again this inspector general and said, hey, we need those files. We need all of them. It wasn't the Counterintelligence Division. At that point, it was the Public Corruptions Division, which was continuing on, even though the Department of Justice had said, there's no crime there. We're not going to prosecute, but we're going to use the law here, right? It's a sword, not a shield. Now, what's the accountability here? This has all been revealed. It's 7 years in arrears. Really, what has been the fallout? Well, that remains to be seen. I think that the reality that we're learning about this now, and it's being reported, and there's going to be probably some hearings and wailing and gnashing of teeth on television, lots of Fox News hits and articles. But really, were the evildoers ever punished? Well, I think that there's 3 people I can think of right now who likely need to be held accountable for engaging in activities that were diametrally opposed to their oath of office. They were using the law as a sword rather than a shield, not the law or the policy, the procedure, using the tools at your disposal, having been in government, having sworn that oath, saying, you know what, I want a political outcome. So I'm just going to push and push and push. And that's not your job. So who are our 3? Let's go to the Inspector General, Michael Atkinson. While he's no longer in government service, he's gone to the private sector and he works for this law firm. This law firm, what is it? Crowell and Mooring. Crowell and Mooring, top tier international law firm that's bringing in $626 million every single year in revenue. So he found a nice landing place for himself. Now, how about Alexander Vindman? Well, immediately after leaving public service, he went to work for the Charles Kettering Foundation. It was nonpartisan. They just really, really love themselves democracy being a code word for the left, meaning things we like. So he went to a leftist 501c3, but he had higher ambitions, which is why he is now he's run for Congress. He's running for United States Senate. He couldn't get elected in Virginia or Maryland, one of those states. So now he moved to my state, the land of milk and honey, and he's going to run as a Democrat to fill Marco Rubio's seat, which is now currently being occupied temporarily by Ashley Moody. So meet Alex Vindman. He's running. He's going to save Florida, even though he's just moved here. He's a carpetbagger. But don't dismiss him, because how much money has Alexander Vindman, with his notoriety and his fame, because he's hashtag resisted since the very beginning. He's an OG resistor of Mr. Trump. Well, he raised $7 million last year. That doughy dude who hasn't had a callus on his hand ever was able to get $7 million to run for Congress. And then the last one, the whistleblower who didn't have any firsthand knowledge. He went to work for a think tank called Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he's pulling down $150,000, $200,000 based on his expertise in third-hand knowledge of phone calls. So that's what the communists do. Reward their friends. Tried their best to punish their enemies. And there's no greater example than we saw with the Trump impeachment. And then that was just one of the various affronts that we saw at the hands of the government that really didn't like the president the first time around and equally doesn't like him now. That's the second time around. Now, the FBI was totally egregious in that. They wound up taking the information from the inspector general for the intelligence community and saying, you know what, I know the Department of Justice said that we're not going to pursue this, but they come and they go, Hobbs. They come and they go. Another attorney general will come in here in a second, and then we'll be cleared hot, which is exactly what they wound up doing when they went after Trump for the public corruption cases that they had, the whole host of cases when the interim between the first and second Trump administration. So we can talk more examples of FBI. And let's check out the signals messages that are now being intercepted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Who here uses Signal? It's one of these encrypted communications. You have it on your device, and then it's encrypted as you send a message to somebody else, and it can't be intercepted. The only way to actually theoretically gain access to that message is when it's on your device or when it's on the recipient's device, if it gets looked at. That's not true. The FBI has now found a way around it, and this is a problem. So, headline: FBI extracts suspects' deleted Signal messages saved in iPhone notification database. This comes from 404 Media. Now, the case in which this was first used or revealed to have been used involves the terrorist attack, I would probably characterize it as, at the detention facility in Texas, where they had somebody shot in the neck by people who were going off outside of the illegal alien confinement area. So hardly innocents who were on trial here, but they are still entitled to due process. They're still entitled to an expectation of privacy. How did this actually happen? So if you use Signal, there's actually a setting that you can put on there when you receive a message. You could get a notification that just says, you have a message, nothing further. You could up it a little bit and says, you got a message from a certain person. Or if you want to be the most open with it, it'll pop up on your screen of your phone before you even open your phone. And it says, you got a message, it came from this person, and here's the first few words of it. Now, that is maintained on the hardware of the iPhone. Did you know that? How many of you want to go into your settings right now if you use Signal? I know I did. I made sure. I went into the top left-hand corner and changed the settings so that I only find out the name of the individual who sent me a message, because I don't want any contents preserved on the iPhone. And this could be sort of a hang up with the Apple software, but it is actually being exploited right now by the government. Another piece that comes from 404 here is actually a little bit dated. This comes from June. And again, it's about Apple and Google giving away this information specifically to the push notifications. That's what it is. When you get the ding on your phone, that's called a push notification. So I'll pull up this one. Headline: Apple gave governments data on thousands of push notifications. And this isn't limited to the FBI or the American government. This is actually international, where they point out how many requests came in from all these different countries. To our purposes, the United States, they made 99 requests for this data, 345 different push tokens, and received 65 of the requests in 2023. So this is not new technology. This is not a new exploitation at the hands of the United States government. And I think we can safely assume that the FBI is making most of those requests. And then one last adjoining piece comes from Reuters. And this is, again, a little bit dated, comes from December 2023. Headline: government spying on Apple and Google users through push notifications. This is according to a letter that was written by United States Senator Wyden from Oregon, who he is a Democrat, but he's actually been pretty consistent on privacy matters here. So from this piece, apps of all kinds rely on push notifications to alert smartphone users to incoming messages. What users often do not realize, though, is that almost all such notifications travel over Google and Apple's servers. So when it travels across their server, they capture that information. It could just say message received. It could say message received from a particular sender. It could say message received from a particular sender. And here's the first sentence of that message. That's now being housed not just within Signal, but by Google, by Apple, and they play pretty nice with the government. Now, that's a result of a couple different things. There's a lot of people who work for Google and work for Apple who used to work for the government. They have those relationships, those public-private partnerships. There's some regulations that are attached from Big Daddy, Uncle Sam. Do you really want us to crack down on you, or do you want to just play really nice with us? There's political reasons. The individuals from Silicon Valley, they're far leftists. By and large, they agree with bigger government intrudes, and they're more than happy to cooperate if the target of some sort of investigation happens to be from the opposition. Let's punish our enemies. Let's use those processes. Let's use the law as a sword rather than a shield. Ooh, have you been photographed wearing a red MAGA hat? Do you go out there and protest gaying of the kids at school board meetings? Did you have a problem putting that gene juice in your arm? Are you posting that online? Well, we'll be happy to turn that over. And that doesn't say anything about the international angle to it as well. There are counterparts for our government and foreign governments. The piece that was from 404, it dealt with foreign governments as well as the American government. Well, you don't have the protections overseas if you're an American. What's to stop the American government from contacting one of their foreign counterparts and being like, hey, why don't you put the request in? We got this pesky, dusty document, this constitution that says that we can't just look through their papers, even if they're digital. Could you do us a solid and do that for us? And then, in the course of sharing intelligence, you just do that. That's what went on with Donald Trump. The United States government pinged their foreign partners to try to elicit information from the Trump campaign when they were overseas. The exact same protocols and processes could be used here digitally. You don't actually have to be in the room with the person. So you can see how the sword shield adaptation here is erring more towards the offensive use of the law and the procedures to go after those who deem to be engaging in activities or thoughts that the government has a problem with. Now, the first element that I mentioned here between the public and private partnerships, it enables the government to not just work cohesively from the Fed side to the Google side, and we want to be in a symbiotic relationship where we're hand-holding and singing Kumbaya. And also, I'm here, I'm coming up on my 20 years with the Feds, and I'm only 45 years old, so I still have some working years left. Maybe I could land myself a nice retirement gig. When I turn 50, I'll punch out, and then I'll head on over to Amazon or Meta or Google, and I'll make 3 or 4 times what I was making. Now, are you a high-speed, low-drag candidate, age 50? Maybe, but that'd be kind of the exception. The rule would be, you've been a government employee for a quarter of a century. You're kind of used to coming in late, leaving early. Federal Friday is a thing. Do you have that much subject matter expertise? I mean, even if you're an attorney, well, that just says that you probably were not a good enough attorney to be recruited by a white shoe law firm to leave the government so that you can go defend high-paying clients for $500 an hour. Not the best of the best. So why would private tech companies offer lucrative jobs to government employees when they leave the government? Well, there is a quid pro quo attached to it. And I think this guy here does a pretty good job of explaining the problem here. Let's give this a play and then we can react.
What ends up happening in corporate America these days, which is fascinating, if you're a big company like Google, this happened to a friend of mine at Google. Mm-hmm. He worked at Google. He worked for Waymo, which is Google's self-driving thing. Yeah. He left and went to Uber.
Oh, yeah, I know this guy. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Google picked up the phone. They called a law firm like Latham Watkins. I'm not picking on Latham. Great firm. Or Ropes and Gray or Kramer Levin. Pick your big law firm, right? And they said, hey, we want to report a crime. Now, why don't you call the police or the FBI or something like that? You don't, because at these big law firms, almost everyone at those firms, the partners, and I know this because I've paid every law firm in New York City, these law firms are staffed with people who were prosecutors. So what they do is they say, oh, let's say you're a partner at one of these big law firms, and a guy from Google calls, and you say, well, you don't even have to look. You know Google's your biggest client. They may be paying the firm 10, 20 million. Some of that's your salary. and the guy's calling and says, hey, John, you've been my lawyer for 8 years. You've been representing Google great. We just got ripped off by this guy. I need you to call the prosecutors that you used to work with, and you got to go indict this guy. And this poor guy, Andrew's name, he got indicted. And the pretext was that he stole trade secrets.
That sounds a lot like my friend Amy Nelson, doesn't it? Amy Nelson, married to Carl Nelson, worked for Amazon, left the employee of Amazon off on his own. And then all of a sudden, during the coronavirus lockdowns, they get a knock at the door. It's the FBI with a search warrant. We're going to charge Carl with honest services fraud, which essentially means that the federal government has a law that says it's illegal to be a bad employee. They charge him. Well, did the Department of Justice just on its own start looking into Carl Nelson? No. They were lobbied by Amazon. The exact same thing that happened here. In the case of the Nelsons, they dealt with years of this. Civil asset forfeiture, prosecutions, fighting for their freedom. Eventually, a judge tosses it and says, this is so egregious, it has no place in a courtroom. And yet they still had to fight to get back the money that the government took from them, and they didn't get it all. Now, this specific instance here, this probably deserves its own podcast or week of podcasts because it deals with self-driving cars and Google and Uber. It's a very, very long story. I actually went to The New Yorker about it. I will throw it up, and I'll put a link to the article in today's show notes. If you want to read through it, it's going to take you a while. But the headline, did Uber steal Google's intellectual property? Now, I went all the way down, and the point I want to make for us today is we're talking about sword or shield. Here's a quote from this article. Instead of requiring that government agencies conducting criminal investigations use a search warrant, as Google's website has proclaimed, the company allowed federal investigators to review the private testimonies and records and to examine internal computer logs. In some cases, lawyers suggested to the U.S. Attorney's Office which documents to subpoena. This allowed the company to hand over private information to the government without officially cooperating. Because this entire prosecution was actually downstream of a civil litigation. You had Uber and Google going back and forth in civil case, and then things didn't go exactly the way they wanted to. So they wind up lobbying the federal government to go after somebody and say, hey, all this stuff we got in discovery in the course of preparing for a civil trial where we're going to go back and forth for millions and billions of dollars. Why don't you take it, Big Daddy government, and go ahead and prosecute this guy for it too? And they didn't have to get a search warrant. And in order to get a search warrant, you would need probable cause of crime, which they didn't have, but it was just freely handed over. It's the symbiotic relationship between big tech and the government. They're colluding with each other because they can both mutually benefit. Big tech here is going to benefit. They're going to wind up prosecuting somebody who they have an axe to grind against. And if they do that successfully, well, that'll bode really well if we take this thing into civil court, right? And the government's going to benefit multiple ways. They get to claim a big giant headline, a takedown of some public corruption case. They also get to shake some hands when they go out to have that meeting in the mahogany-lined corporate office and say, hey, I'm 48 years old here. I've been a career prosecutor in a couple of years. I'm looking to punch out. Might you have a position for me as general counsel over here at Google? It's exactly what happened. And I can tell you exactly what happened because the prosecutor in this case, his name is Matt Perella. He has now gone off to greener pastures. He works for Simple Mining LLC. They're not mining for coal in Kentucky. They're mining for Bitcoin. And they are estimated as a company to be worth about $6 million. So he found a nice place for himself to land in Silicon Valley, having been a good and faithful servant. All right, let's do some other examples of using the law as a sword. Now, I saw this reported in Revolver News. Headline, why are so many sober drivers ending up with DUI charges? Well, this is actually from a local news report, Channel 2 Action News, that looked into Georgians, not the country, actually, Georgia on my mind. They had a report of the number of DUI arrests in 2025. 701 people tested by the Georgia Bureau of Investigations in 2025 had no illegal or prescription drugs found in their systems during the toxicology screenings. So these were people who were arrested, allegedly, for having had too much alcohol in their system, or if they couldn't prove that, they said, well, you're probably high on drugs. You blew double zeros, triple zeros here on the breathalyzer, so we're gonna still take you because we see that you are impaired, and 701 of them were not. Well, how does that happen? And they give a couple of examples. There was one guy who was 65 years old. He blew triple zeros in the breathalyzer, still winds up getting taken. There was a 19-year-old who was a football player. The police suspected that he was high on marijuana, and he said, quote, I don't drink, never have, haven't done drugs, never have. It's just not what I do. And then the cop says, well, I have a suspicion that you have, and he winds up spending the night in jail. Now, how does that happen? Well, there's these roadside sobriety tests, and there's a lot of holes in these. I never really was certified on them, and was not, doing traffic enforcement was never something I was particularly interested in when I was a uniformed patrol officer. But there were guys who did. There were guys who went to the school. They learned how to do the stuff where you put the pen in front of your face and they go side to side and to see if their pupils are dilating. You got to make them walk the line, see if they have problems balancing. And there are a lot of pitfalls with these tests. And I know some attorneys now that are involved in defense, and they say, yeah, there's a million ways you can punch holes in it, be it from a punctuation error in the officer's report to saying, well, the blue lights were going in the background, that interfered with their vision. There's all these problems. How about a fundamental question that needs to be examined? And I'm not really ready to weigh in on it. It's something I'm probably going to have to think about a lot more. If you go to a sobriety checkpoint, you can't say, get a warrant. If you refuse to do the breathalyzer when the officer pulls you over at a sobriety check, you get arrested. No questions. So we as a society have made a decision that you don't have a presumption of innocence at a sobriety checkpoint. How does that comport with our pesky, dusty documents? Now, I realize that driving on a road is not itemized within the Constitution that says you have a right to drive on the road, and there's a public safety measure here, and there's a question about that. So right versus privilege. Again, going to have to think through it. But again, there is a presumption of innocence allegedly in the land of the free. And we have just as a society made the decision, well, except in this circumstance, we're going to presume you're guilty and you're going to have to prove you're innocent. That's hardly using the law as a shield in that case. Why do we have laws? Do we have laws to protect the innocent? Is that protecting the innocent? Or is it maybe setting up an opportunity for those who are inclined to do it? Like they have the Nighthawks in Georgia, we'll use that as an example. Those are the Georgia State Troopers. They like to go out there. Man, I'll tell you what, if you're working midnight shift, you want to get a Nighthawk on the line, you think you got a drunk driver, that's going to kill half your shift. Unless you like it, it sucks to sit and babysit a drunk driver. But you get that Nighthawk on the radio, those guys love it. They'll show up, they'll take that DUI right off their hands. They'll bang that thing out in half an hour because they do it. That's their full-time gig. But is it really using the law as a shield? I don't know. Just throwing the question out. I want to talk about this, though, because this is pretty cut and dried as violative of the principles that we're laying out. And this is a piece from Reason. And it's a consideration right now for the Supreme Court. That's the wrong one. Here it is. Headline: Police destroyed innocent people's property and left them with the bill. Will the Supreme Court step in? Now, this is two different people, one in Los Angeles, California, the other one in Indiana. So in LA, a SWAT team from the city of Los Angeles blew up Carlos Pena's shop after a suspect ejected Pena from the business and barricaded himself. So a guy who was run away from the police kicks this dude out of his own business, barricades it. SWAT winds up just wrecking the place in order to get this guy. But they didn't. He wound up escaping. So that's not good. Second example, Amy Hadley, she had her house search warrant because there was an IP address that led police to believe that there was an evildoer at her house, and they were wrong. Both Pena and Hadley asked the local government to compensate them. Hey, you wrecked my business. Hey, you wrecked my house. Can I get compensated for that? The local officials said, no, we're not paying for that. We were acting in good faith. We don't owe you anything. Now, in the case of the business out in Los Angeles, this guy was out like 60 grand. And insurance wouldn't cover it because insurance is in business to make money, not actually do good by their clients. Just ask me, because dealing with that, having been in an automobile accident, insurance said, nope. If it happens with the government, we're not liable to reimburse you anything that you're out. Now, with the woman in Indiana, Amy Hadley, she was out 16 grand and insurance only covered some of it. Both of them now suing. Now, we have a pesky, dusty document with a bunch of amendments in it. One of them is the Fifth Amendment. It isn't just a right to take the Fifth. I don't have to testify against myself. An element of our Fifth Amendment in this country is the takings clause. The takings clause says, quote, you are owed just compensation if the government does something. That's where we get into this eminent domain. If they seize your property, you are owed the fair market value. What happens if they wreck your property? Isn't that a just takings? Well, courts are saying up to this point, no. So two separate appeals courts, because we're dealing with somebody in California and somebody with Indiana. First, California, the Ninth Circuit, which tends to hate the police unless it's here. So throw up the reason piece again. Here's what the Ninth Circuit said. Law enforcement officers destroyed his shop while acting reasonably in the necessary defense of public safety. Okay. That means that you can't sue the officers. They have qualified immunity. But the Ninth Circuit says that no, you can't actually sue the government at all for just compensation. And then we'll go to the Seventh Circuit for Indiana. Quote, the Fifth Amendment does not require the state to compensate for property damage resulting from police executing a lawful search warrant. So I guess you just have to eat the expense if the police screw up and come to your house with a search warrant. And look, they have probable cause. They're allowed to be there. They're allowed to search. Even if you're the guilty party, you have to eat the cost. How? How is that punishing evil? How is that using the law as a shield? If anything, you could argue that they just, quote, made a mistake and made the process the punishment. And now those local jurisdictions are covering up for the police who screwed up in both instances. Now, I'm not saying they shouldn't have been there. They should have been there if they had probable cause, that there was an evildoer at a particular house. Yeah, you go in, execute a search warrant. If you have probable cause to believe that there's an evildoer inside the shop who's barricaded himself, exhaust all reasonable measures to bring that guy to justice. But you then owe just compensation. So the Supreme Court is going to actually have to adjudicate this. And the reality is that this shouldn't be a question. If you had a law enforcement apparatus, if you had a federal government just writ large, it was an objective force for good, it would say, yeah, we drove a truck through your front door, we owe you just compensation. And yet they're still fighting it because they don't view you, or in these cases, this Carlos Pena, this Amy Hadley, as a customer anymore. You're the opposition. You're the opportunity. And you can bet if they pulled you over on a traffic stop, you would have to walk the line. You would have to blow into that breathalyzer. And when they're not punishing evil, they are in effect rewarding evil. They're punishing good. So let's go to an adjoining piece I have from CBS News, and this is about illegal aliens. Headline, ICE detained fewer non-criminals since Minnesota crackdown, driving a decline in detention population. They're all criminals. Every illegal alien. The first word is illegal. They've all violated the border. Violating the border is a crime last time I checked. But we're going to have to delineate now. So CBS is very happy to report that the number of people in ICE custody declined by 12% from January to March. Nationwide, ICE arrested an average of about 1,040 people every day from mid-February into March. 1,040 people. That would be about 380,000 a year, roughly a million if they continued on that track by the end of Donald Trump's term. Does that sound like mass deportations? This marks the first major decline since Trump returned to office and began an unprecedented deportation crackdown because the election has been made, not the vote for it, but the election, a course of action. The Epstein administration, that is the Trump Part 2, has now elected to go soft on mass deportations. And what happens when they do that? They say, oh, we're just going to go for the worst offenders, the worst of the worst. Everybody else, I guess, ollie, oxen free. They are punishing good by failing to punish evil. All right. I got a couple of examples, though, of results of weaponized government going the good direction, but they never should have gone. But before we do, guys, this is your once per show reminder. If you haven't already, you're watching us here on Rumble or YouTube at AmRadPod. Do give us a thumbs up, the follows, the subscribes, the shares, all of those things. Leave a comment. Appreciate it. And if we get done today and you want to go head on over to Spotify, we appreciate that. Again, AmRadPod. Follow us there. And if an advertiser elects to wind up running an ad now, now would be the time. Guys, I'll give you the heads up. I'll run it right about now. We'll see if we're lucky enough to pick up an advertiser. And if not, that's okay. We're going to try to continue to grow there so that we can monetize this podcast. All right. A couple of examples. This one eluded my attention, and mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. The Washington Post, because their democracy dies in darkness. Who remembers the Coast Guard sharpshooter, Peter Stinson? He was out there making threats against the president. He winds up getting arrested. Headline, jury acquits Virginia man who called for Trump's assassination. So we did a deep dive on this guy because everything he said was protected by the First Amendment. This was no different than the other guy who was arrested by the Biden administration. His name escapes me right now. Dang it. What was that guy's name? One of you will have to put it in the show notes. The Heritage Foundation found this guy saying things that were mean on Twitter or Blue Sky or all these other different platforms and referred him over to the FBI. So the FBI went in there and they looked at what he was saying. He was saying, well, I wouldn't kill him, but somebody needs to. All that's protected by the First Amendment. And nonetheless, we're going to use the law as a sword to go after our political enemies. So the FBI, in due course, winds up charging this guy, Peter Stinson. He gets arrested. He takes it all the way to trial. The process is the punishment. Now, this guy actually got a public defender. So he's not out like $500,000, and he took it to a jury. So from the piece from the Washington Post, throw it up. What winds up happening is he's acquitted. The judge, though, denied the defense attorney their pretrial request to dismiss the indictment because there's the First Amendment. So we actually had to wind up going. Well, how is that justice? We have a First Amendment. You're allowed to say mean things. You're allowed to say horrible, racist things. As long as there's not a true threat, then you're supposed to be allowed to do that. And yet, our government saw fit to bring charges against this guy, Peter Stinson. He does get acquitted. Probably had something to do with it being in Virginia, which does not like the Department of Justice now because it's under the president who's mean, orange, and literally Hitler. But it doesn't negate the reality that we're supposed to follow the process. Everybody's entitled to due process, to civil rights. Douglas Mackey, that was that guy's name. I knew it was in the back of my head. Douglas Mackey, same thing happened to him. He was out there saying, hey, text your vote for Hillary Clinton. And then the Biden administration came in just before the statute of limitations and charged him. Same thing. That's not illegal. We have a First Amendment in this country. It entitles you allegedly to free speech. Now, Peter Stinson, he's going to go free, but he never should have had this ordeal to begin with, because in an objectively good country that believes in free speech, you're allowed to be a jerk. You don't go to jail for it. And yet they brought the charges anyway. The other one, which is not a total clearing of the slate because it's still going on, comes from Headline USA. Headline says, charges dropped against Minnesota mom who used racial slur towards Haitian. And now this woman, what's her name? Gosh, Shiloh Hendricks. She's the one who was dropping the N-bomb against a 5-year-old Haitian kid because he's a black kid. He's autistic, this kid. He winds up stealing her kid's food and running away, and she drops an N-bomb, gets caught on video. And then charges came. This was in Rochester, Minnesota. And we have a nice quote from the mayor of Rochester. Quote, "This was a situation that deeply affected many people, especially our communities of color, and caused real turmoil in our community. We acknowledge the lasting impact this incident has had, not only on those directly involved and across our community, but also in the broader conversations happening at the state and national level." How about the impact of the police arresting someone for using naughty language? That's not illegal. That's all that matters. You don't have to have a broader conversation about racism. Nope. The conversation we need to have is about the Gestapo coming in and arresting a woman for exercising her First Amendment rights. That's the broader conversation. That's the violation. That's using the law as a sword rather than a shield. Now, they dropped one of the charges. Another one still remains, and she is facing 90 days in jail and a $1,000 fine and continuing to fight it all the way. Now, the last piece I have is just sort of a thematic piece for the day, and it's close, but it comes from the Federalist, so it doesn't quite get it all the way because they are right of center and they want their perceived outcomes to happen. Headline, only prosecutions can end Democrats' DOJ weaponization, but media pretend that's not obvious. They're close. Only prosecutions can end DOJ weaponization. I could do without the Democrats. So from the piece, Americans who want lawfare perpetrators punished were frustrated that Pam Bondi's shortcomings left room for Democrats to weaponize the DOJ against conservatives again, as prominent leftists have promised to do. The only thing that will stop the next crossfire hurricane or Arctic frost from targeting untold opponents of the American left with character assassination, financial ruin, privacy invasion, and even prison is the fear of just penalties for such corruption. That's true, but it's hardly sufficient. We need prosecutions of those who brought charges against Peter Stinson as well. Because when you are in a position of authority, if you raise your hand and swear that oath to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that includes the First Amendment. That includes illegal search and seizure. That includes just compensation. It doesn't matter. The institution is what's broken. Now, one side is better at weaponizing those institutions. That is hardly a mystery. The left in this country loves to use the institutions to reward their friends and punish their enemies. We see the Eric Charamella come forward with a fake whistleblower allegation and then find himself a nice landing place. We have Vindman. Alexander Vindman, well, he's got his government pension and now he's going to try to run for office. So reward our friends, punish our enemies. Vindman's gotten $7 million to his coffers to run. But the principles that we hold to on this program, on the American Radicals podcast, is that weaponized government, regardless of who is in charge, is the enemy. Those who engage in it have to be punished. It doesn't matter if they got an R by their name or a D by their name. The stakes have to be huge. If you take your position, the position that you're lucky enough, that you are privileged enough to hold, and you fail to see that opportunity, and you use it as an opportunity instead of protecting and defending our pesky, dusty documents, protecting your fellow countrymen from fraud and force, instead bastardize it and exploit it for political gain, for financial gain, to punish those who you see as your political enemies, then you go to jail. That's the only way to rectify the problem. All right, guys, that's the end for the day. But I do have a nice, fun palate cleanse for us today. I had nothing to do with weaponization, just a kid who figured out how to play Crazy Train on his own, instruments that he's invented. So a fun way to send us off for the day. That was pretty impressive. I don't care. I don't care what you say. That kid's got skills. All right, guys, we'll plan to be back with you tomorrow noontime here, Rumble and YouTube. And until then, have a great day.
You've been listening to the American Radicals Podcast. Find us on YouTube, Rumble, and X at AmRadPod.